Good morning, church. Sorry for that long, awkward pause. This morning, we continue our journey through the book of Esther. For those of you who've been following along, or if you haven't been with us, today we find ourselves in chapter 6. A little refresher. We read last week through chapter 5, and if you'll remember, at the very end of the chapter, Haman has built a huge 50-cubit high pole on which to impale Mordecai. This is the plan. This is where we are. And so we pick it up in chapter 6, verse 1. It reads like this. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.' Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. How many of you are familiar with the great grapefruit strike? No, I didn't make it up. In 1984, in Dublin, Ireland, there was a woman named Mary Manning. She was a 21-year-old cashier at a grocery store called Dunn's. It was a part of a chain there in Ireland. As she is standing at her register, a woman approaches and has a basket loaded with two bright yellow grapefruits, South African grapefruits. Mary's heart pounds. She remembers her union's directive: don't touch apartheid goods. So she looks the customer in the eye and says, "I can't sell you those." She's suspended on the spot. And then something crazy starts to happen. Her coworkers drop everything. Tills are abandoned, aisles are emptied, and they march out together. 10 of them stay out. 10. Not political strategists, just tired, underpaid, disrespected workers. Then comes a man named Nimrod. Nimrod is a South African exile who once shared a cell with Nelson Mandela. These workers, these 10 workers who had started this strike because of the directive of their union, but primarily because they were ticked off at the way they were being treated by the Dunn's grocery store chain, started to learn from Nimrod. Nimrod begins to show up every day at the picket line with these 10 people, and he begins to explain and tell them what apartheid really means. Their protest shifts from rule following to heart following. They face police crackdowns, priests preach against them, politicians look away, but the crowds grow. Then Desmond Tutu comes to London on his way to receive his Nobel Peace Prize, and he invites the 10 strikers to come to London and meet with him. The story explodes. They are flown to South Africa to get to see, to attempt to see apartheid in real life, and they are arrested at the airport. Along with them on that plane were a whole bunch of journalists who began to tell that story and to broadcast it around the world. Frederick Buechner, the author, said that there is no event so commonplace I love this stuff. Man. It worked in rehearsal, folks. Give me 1 second. We're going to get this today. All right. Plan B.
Take your time, Pastor. We're not going anywhere.
Peter, can you go check that? We'll just, yeah. So Frederick Buechner, the author, says, there is no event so commonplace, but that God is present within it, always leaving you room to recognize him or not to recognize him. There is no event so commonplace, but that God is present within it, always leaving you room to recognize him or not to recognize him. So we have come to the place in the text, as I said before we read it, where Esther has gone to the king. She has stepped into the idea of for such a time as this. And we all resonate with that. Just skip it. We all resonate with that idea, right? That's the idea that we kind of gravitate to. We think of those moments where maybe this is my Esther moment for such a time as this. and she was courageous, and she went to the king, and she did all of those things. But the crazy thing is that the hinge point of this story isn't that. It's not for such a time as this. It's not when she goes in before the king and the king allows her to come and she makes her request and she's wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove and she works her plan to make her big request. At the point of the story that we're at now, the pole for impaling Mordecai has been built, and Haman is in the court to make his request. Things do not look good. So what's the hinge point of the story? The hinge point of the story is chapter 6, verse 1, part A, the first half of the verse. That night the king could not sleep. That night, the king could not sleep. This is the hinge point of the story. Now, ironically, the same night that the king cannot sleep, Haman cannot sleep. And Haman is so excited about his plan. He is so ready to finally put Mordecai in his place that he wants to be the first one that the king talks to that morning. And so he is in the court early, in the early hours of the morning. Neither one can sleep. Esther has made her plans, and that plan has been put into place, but at this point in the story, it sure looks like it's not going to have time to unfold. Esther has taken faithful actions in the midst of uncertain outcomes, but things still look pretty bleak. But that night the king could not sleep. And so he orders the annals, the history of his reign to be brought and read to him, as we can assume a cure for insomnia. And as he's listening to these events unfold, it just so happens that on the night that the king just so happens to not be able to sleep, and he just so happens to ask that the history of his reign be brought and read, it just so happens that whoever's reading this to him opens up the book to the point 4 or 5 years prior when Mordecai had saved the king from an assassination plot. And the king realizes that he never rewarded Mordecai. And this was a big deal in that culture. One of the ways, and this is, some things never change, one of the ways that leaders and kings make sure that people stay loyal to them is to reward those who do things that they like. And so King Xerxes says, well, what was done for Mordecai? Well, nothing, Your Majesty. You didn't do anything. And the king is like, well, we got to fix that. Who's in the court? And Haman just so happens to be in the court. And so he goes to Haman and he says, what should be done for the one that the king desires to honor? And Haman, and being the ultimate egotistical sycophant that he was, immediately recognizes to the core of his very being that, of course, it's me. It's me. The king's going to honor me. And what can the king give me? Well, he's already made me the second most powerful person in all of the empire of Persia. So what can I do other than to have the king let me dress up and act like the king? right? I mean, in some ways, this is such a beautiful picture of the kind of sick loyalty that happens in these situations. There is nothing left for Haman to have except what he truly wants, to be king. And so he says to the king, well, the one that you want to honor should be given one of your robes to wear, and he should be given one of the horses that you've ridden to ride, and someone should lead them through the city and sing their praises. And as we see, the great reversal is about to happen. And things are about to change. And so, the king says to Haman, go and get Mordecai and lead him through the city, because not today, Haman. Here are just a few reversals that we see in the book of Esther. In chapter 4, time for a drink of water. In chapter 4, verse 1, Mordecai wears sackcloth and ashes. In chapter 6, verse 11, Mordecai wears royal robes. In chapter 4, verse 1, Mordecai goes through the city crying, rending his garments, grieving. In chapter 6, verse 11, Mordecai is led through the city in honor, wearing the king's robe, riding the king's horse. In chapter 5:14, Zeresh, Haman's wife, advises Mordecai's death. In chapter 6, verse 13, Zeresh predicts Haman's ruin. The reversal has begun on the night that the king couldn't sleep. The king couldn't sleep. One commentator summarized it this way: in the hands of God, even one night of insomnia can become a redemptive pivot point that will dramatically change the course of events. Now, if you know the history of God and his people in the Old Testament, we know that previously in Israel's history, God used mighty events in order to rescue his people. He used all kinds of things. Think of just the Exodus story alone. All the different ways that God intervened in supernatural ways in the history of the people of Israel as they were seeking to be released from bondage in Egypt. Plagues, sending Moses, crossing the Red Sea, all of those things. But here in this story, God uses seemingly ordinary, mundane events to reveal his purposes. God delivered the people of Israel in Persia because the king had a sleepless night. Because a man would not bow to his superior, because a woman found herself taken to the bedroom of a ruthless man for a night of pleasure. How inscrutable are the ways of the Lord. That's from a commentary on Esther. Imagine a God who is able to use the most mundane events of life to deliver his people. This is an important reminder. We talked last week about that idea of being prepared as Esther was, to have courage, to be ready to step into our Esther moment for such a time of this, and to do so being wise as serpents and innocent as doves, doing it in a way that makes sense and is smart. But we always need God, because our efforts alone aren't enough to deliver God's purposes. And the story serves to remind us that sometimes God shows up in the midst of a sleepless night. So back to our friends, the grapefruit strikers in Ireland. They started their strike in 1984. And as I said, they met a great deal of resistance, including from the church, from politicians, from their own union, in fact, who had ordered them to not sell the South African goods. But these 10, they stuck with it. And in 1987, Ireland became the first Western country to ban South African imports, with a few cashiers with a picket sign helped chip away at apartheid's armor. Now, obviously, there are a whole lot of other pieces that go into the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. But at least one link in the chain in the West were 10 underpaid workers in Dublin, Ireland, who refused to sell South African goods. God showed up in the mundane events. I was reminded this week of a season in my life, early in my ministry, where I found myself in the midst of an incredibly conflicted situation. And it was really painful. And there was a lot of high stress, all kinds of things. We were early in ministry. We had 3 little kids under the age of 3.5. Insanity. Or brilliance, one of the two. And I went to a retreat, and someone gave me a quote from Andrew Murray, which I wrote in the back of the Bible that I used at the time, which, Gretchen, I think I left it down in the aisle. We just hold it up. So you see, it's just a tiny little Bible. I used to be able to read that, by the way. I took it out the other day, and I was like, yeah, there's a reason I put that away. But in the back of that Bible, I wrote this quote from Andrew Murray, that this person, I don't even remember their name, but this quote has stuck with me, and it got me through. It was so meaningful to me in this season that I was in that seemed hopeless and beyond redemption. It goes like this: He brought me here. It is by His will that I am in this difficult place. In that I will rest. Second, He will keep me here in His love and give me grace for this trial to behave as His child. Third, He will make the trial a blessing, teaching me the lessons He intends me to learn and working in me the grace He means to bestow. Fourth, in His good time, He can bring me out again. How and when, He knows. So, I am here by His appointment, in His keeping, under His training, for His time. One author wrote this in reflection around the story of Esther and these reversals that we talked about. The cross of Jesus Christ is the pivot point of the great reversal of history, where our sorrow has been turned into joy. All of these, and you can follow through the entire story of God's pursuit of humanity from the beginning of the Old Testament all the way through, and you will find time and again these places where mundane events are the place where God begins to work, where God begins to turn the story. I was also reminded of being a young, I don't know, probably early teenager. My parents brought us to this Christian music festival called Sunshine that used to happen near where we grew up. It was like, I don't know, 8,000 or 10,000 people sitting in a field listening to Christian music and preachers. And I will never forget that one of those preachers, one of the first times I went, was Anthony Campolo. And he gave his sermon that then became a book. It's Friday, but Sunday. But Sunday is coming. Of course, Campolo was riffing off of Reverend S.M. Lockridge of Calvary Baptist Church in San Diego. We always want to give credit because, let's be honest, we all know it wasn't a white man that wrote that line. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Haman has built the pole on which Mordecai is to be impaled. Things are not looking good. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Jesus is hanging on the cross, the instrument of imperial crucifixion, execution. Things are not looking good. It's Friday, but Sunday. But Sunday's coming. You find yourself in a place that seems hopeless. Maybe it's a diagnosis, a medical issue. But you cling to that refrain. It's Friday. But Sunday's coming. Maybe it's that broken relationship. The one with your spouse, or the one with your kids, or the one with your parents. Whichever one it is, seems broken beyond repair. It's Friday. But Sunday's coming. We find ourselves in an era, in a season, when maybe it seems that injustice and oppression and racism and hatred and violence are going to carry the day. It's Friday. As the band comes, my prayer for you and for me and for those who find themselves living in fear is that you would remember that even if it's Friday, Sunday's coming. Amen.